There's a piece of this war that almost nobody saw coming a few years ago, and it's this. The same scrappy little drone boats that chased Russia's entire Black Sea fleet out of the western Black Sea, without Ukraine ever fielding a single traditional warship, are now becoming the blueprint for how the United States is hunting down Iran's navy in the Persian Gulf. That's not an exaggeration, and it's not a stretch of the imagination. It's something defense officials, shipbuilders, and the Pentagon's own budget requests have been quietly confirming for months now, even as most of the public conversation about this conflict stays focused on fighter jets, bunker buster bombs, and the daily strike counts coming out of CENTCOM. Ukraine essentially handed over the playbook for asymmetric naval warfare, a way to sink or disable a much larger, much more expensive, conventional fleet using cheap, fast, expendable unmanned boats. And American forces have been adapting that exact doctrine against the one navy in the world that's built almost entirely around small, fast, swarming attack craft, which is precisely the kind of target this doctrine was built to beat from the very beginning. Let's start with where this all actually began, because the story of Ukraine's naval drones is one of the more remarkable underdog stories of modern warfare. When Russia's full-scale invasion started, Ukraine had almost no navy left to speak of, a handful of ships, nothing capable of challenging Russia's Black Sea fleet in any conventional sense. Russia used that fleet to blockade Odessa, choke off Ukrainian grain exports, and launch cruise missiles into Ukrainian cities more or less unopposed. And instead of trying to rebuild a traditional navy from scratch, which would have taken years and resources Ukraine simply didn't have, Ukrainian engineers built something else entirely. Low-cost, remotely piloted surface drones packed with explosives, cheap enough that losing one barely registered as a cost, but fast and low enough in the water to slip past traditional defenses and detonate against the hull of a warship worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The math on that trade is almost absurd. When you actually look at it, a single one of these drone boats costs a few $100,000, less than the price of one modern torpedo, and it's been used to help sink or disable roughly a dozen Russian warships since the war began, according to assessments from the QSO Naval Institute. That kind of return on investment doesn't just win battles, it rewrites doctrine. And it did more than just sink ships. It fundamentally changed the balance of power in the entire western Black Sea. Russia's fleet, once able to operate freely along Ukraine's coastline, was forced to pull its main operations back to Novorossiysk, hundreds of miles away from where it used to patrol without a second thought. Ukraine's president put it about as plainly as you can, saying Russian ships simply don't approach Ukraine's shores anymore because of what these drones are capable of doing to them. Think about that for a second. A country with essentially no traditional navy managed to push back one of the largest naval fleets on the planet, using boats that look more like oversized jet skis than warships. That's the kind of result that gets every serious navy in the world taking notes, and it's exactly what happened. The flagship platform in all of this is a system Ukrainians call the Sea Baby, a strike boat operated by Ukraine's security service that started as a fairly simple explosive-laden drone boat and has since evolved into something far more sophisticated, now capable of carrying 6 to 8 small first-person view attack drones in side compartments that pop open mid-mission, along with thermobaric rockets for direct engagement. So it's not just a floating bomb anymore, it's become a mobile launch platform, a mothership that can release its own swarm of smaller attack drones once it gets close enough to a target, extending its reach well beyond what a single drone boat could manage on its own. Alongside the Sea Baby, there's the Magura family of drones, which has become significant enough that it's now heading toward mass production outside Ukraine entirely. A US-based shipbuilder recently signed a deal to manufacture hundreds of these Ukrainian-designed sea drones domestically, which tells you this isn't some experimental side project anymore. It's becoming an actual production pipeline, feeding directly into American naval strategy. Now here's where the story connects directly to what's been happening against Iran. The US military has already used a one-way attack sea drone in actual combat against an Iranian port, and by most accounts, that strike marked the first time this specific category of weapon had ever been used in real combat by American forces. Up until that point, unmanned surface vessels in American hands had mostly been limited to reconnaissance missions, intelligence gathering, and rescue operations, useful but fundamentally support roles rather than offensive weapons. Crossing that line, actually using a sea drone as a strike weapon against a hardened port facility, is a significant shift, and it didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened after months of the Pentagon studying exactly how Ukraine had been using these same categories of platforms against Russia, and after officials explicitly acknowledged that American forces need inexpensive, expendable platforms like these, specifically to counter the kind of asymmetric threat Iran represents. A navy built almost entirely around swarms of small, fast attack boats rather than a handful of large, expensive ships. That last point is worth sitting with for a moment, because it explains why this particular Ukrainian innovation fits the Iran problem so precisely. Iran's naval doctrine has never been about matching the United States ship for ship. That would be a losing fight, and Tehran has known it for decades. Instead, Iran built its naval strategy around the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, operating huge numbers of small, fast attack craft, the kind of boats that can swarm a target from multiple directions at once, overwhelming point defenses through sheer numbers rather than raw firepower. It's the same asymmetric logic Ukraine used against Russia, just flipped. A smaller, cheaper force trying to offset a larger, more expensive one through speed, numbers, and unpredictability. Which means the exact doctrine Ukraine developed to defeat that kind of asymmetric swarm tactic, hunting individual small boats with cheap, fast, expendable drones of your own, rather than relying purely on expensive missiles and manned aircraft, translates almost perfectly onto the exact naval threat Iran poses in the Gulf. It's a genuinely elegant piece of doctrinal transfer, learning to beat a swarm by building your own better, cheaper swarm. It's worth tracing exactly how this relationship formed in the first place, because it didn't start with drone boats at all. It started with a straightforward request for help, defending against a threat Ukraine had already spent years learning to counter. Once direct American military aid to Ukraine was paused earlier this year, officials in Washington reportedly went the other direction and asked Kyiv for help, specifically in defending against Iranian drone attacks that were hammering American bases across the Gulf. Within days, Ukraine's president confirmed his country would send military experts into the region, and shortly after that, a senior Ukrainian negotiator was dispatched specifically to discuss selling interceptor drone technology to American and allied forces. That's a genuinely striking sequence when you lay it out plainly, a country still fighting for its own survival against a full-scale invasion, nonetheless found the bandwidth to send experts and hardware halfway around the world to help a different country fight a different war. And it happened fast, within a matter of days, rather than months of formal negotiation. And Ukraine's president was blunt about why his government was willing to move that quickly, publicly framing the strikes on Iran as a direct blow against the same network that's been arming Russia's war machine, at one point describing Iran outright as an accomplice to Moscow, and noting that Ukraine alone had absorbed tens of thousands of Iranian-supplied drone attacks by that point in the war. From where Kyiv sits, weakening Iran doesn't just help an ally on the other side of the world, it directly weakens the supply chain feeding the war happening in Ukraine's own skies every single night. Let's also talk about the intelligence sharing piece, because the naval drone technology is really only half of what's crossed over from Ukraine into this fight. Ukrainian officials have publicly confirmed that Kyiv is sharing satellite intelligence gathered from its own operations to help track and counter threats tied to Iran, framing it explicitly as support for the broader effort against a regime Ukraine has directly accused of supplying Russia with the very drones that have been used against Ukrainian cities for years now. That accusation isn't rhetorical either. Ukraine has documented Iran signing contracts worth close to $2 billion for drone technology and complete manufacturing blueprints, technology Russia then used to build its own production facility, and is now believed to be manufacturing more than 1,000 modified attack drones a day using Iranian-derived designs. So from Ukraine's perspective, helping degrade Iran's military capability isn't some abstract favor to Washington. It's closing a loop that's been draining Ukrainian lives for years, striking at the source of a weapons pipeline that's been raining down on Ukrainian cities since almost the start of the full-scale invasion. And that relationship has kept deepening in ways that go well beyond naval drones. American forces introduced a Ukrainian-developed counter-drone command and control system at a major airbase in Saudi Arabia specifically to help detect and intercept incoming Iranian drone threats, a system that had been used widely and effectively by Ukraine's own military to track and defeat the same category of Shahed-style drones that Iran has been launching at American positions across the region. The company behind that system built its network around more than 10,000 acoustic sensors scattered across Ukraine, listening for the distinctive engine signature of incoming drones and feeding that data into a shared map that warfighters can use to detect threats and coordinate interceptor drones in response. That's a fundamentally different approach than the radar-heavy, expensive interceptor missile systems the American military has traditionally relied on, and it's specifically well-suited to defeating exactly the kind of cheap, slow-flying, mass-produced drone that Iran has been launching in waves, because you don't need a multi-million-dollar missile to bring down a drone that costs a few $1,000s to build. You just need to see it coming early enough to send something cheaper and faster after it. That deployment happened only after American commanders watched Iranian strikes destroy aircraft, damage buildings, and kill service members at that same base, and it happened despite public statements only a month earlier, dismissing the idea that Ukrainian help was even needed. That's a pretty significant reversal in a short amount of time, going from publicly rejecting Ukrainian assistance to quietly integrating Ukrainian technology into frontline defenses once the threat got real enough to force a change in thinking. Before going further into how this is actually reshaping strategy against Iran's fleet, it's worth pausing here, Because if this kind of connection between two seemingly separate conflicts is the sort of analysis you find valuable, this is a good moment to like this video and subscribe, since this thread, Ukraine's battlefield innovation directly reshaping how America fights an entirely different war on the other side of the world, is genuinely one of the more underreported storylines running through this entire conflict. So let's get into what this actually looks like in practice, because the doctrine transfer here goes well beyond just a single strike on a single port. NATO itself has already started training directly with Ukrainian naval drone tactics, and in a naval drone exercise held in Portugal, Ukraine's Navy led what's called a red team, essentially playing the role of the aggressor force testing NATO's defenses, and beat the alliance's blue force in every single scenario run during that exercise. That's not a minor result. That's Ukraine, a country that started this war with barely a navy at all, outthinking and outmaneuvering some of the most sophisticated conventional naval forces on the planet, using tactics built from necessity rather than decades of Naval Academy doctrine. And this technology transfer isn't staying confined to the Atlantic and the Gulf either. American Special Forces have already used a Ukrainian-designed Magura drone to sink a target ship during a joint exercise in the Philippines, marking the first time this specific Ukrainian technology has been demonstrated in the Indo-Pacific theater, which tells you the Pentagon isn't just borrowing this doctrine for the Iran fight specifically, it's building it into the broader playbook for potential future conflicts as well, most notably the kind of scenario planners war game out involving a much larger and more capable Chinese Navy. And this isn't a one-way relationship where Ukraine only helps from behind the scenes either, because Ukraine has now started taking direct action of its own against the supply chain feeding Iran. Ukrainian forces recently carried out a long-range strike against a Russian cargo vessel in the Caspian Sea, with Ukraine's own ambassador to Israel, confirming the ship was believed to be carrying components for drones and missiles specifically bound for Iran. That strike matters, because it shows the relationship has evolved from Ukraine simply sharing lessons in technology into Ukraine becoming an active participant in disrupting the physical pipeline of weapons and parts flowing between Russia and Iran, treating that entire supply relationship as a single interconnected threat rather than two separate problems. And Ukraine's president has been equally direct about the flip side of that same relationship, publicly stating that Russia has been supplying Iran with its own satellite imagery and orbital surveillance data, effectively helping Tehran target American and allied military facilities across the Middle East. So you've now got a genuinely three-way entanglement: Russia feeding intelligence to Iran, Iran having fed drone technology to Russia for years, and Ukraine actively working to disrupt both ends of that relationship simultaneously, striking the physical supply chain in the Caspian while sharing its own intelligence and technology with the coalition operating against Iran in the Gulf. Now, here's the honesty check, because it's important not to oversell what these small drone boats can and can't actually accomplish on their own. Unmanned surface vessels are genuinely effective at what they do: sea denial, harassment, forcing an enemy fleet to stay further from shore, picking off individual vessels through persistent, low-cost pressure. But they are not a wholesale replacement for the kind of firepower that actually wins a sustained naval campaign. Defense analysts have been fairly blunt about this limitation, pointing out that these small drones simply cannot match the range, accuracy, and raw destructive power of a proper anti-ship cruise missile, weapons that cost several times more per unit but which are far more survivable and carry warheads with genuinely serious punch behind them. And that reality has actually played out clearly in how the broader campaign against Iran's naval capability has unfolded, because the majority of the anti-ship strikes carried out during this conflict have still been executed by air-launched cruise missiles, or in one particularly notable case, a torpedo fired from a nuclear-powered attack submarine, lurking somewhere beneath the surface the entire time. So the honest picture here isn't that drone boats have single-handedly replaced traditional naval firepower against Iran. It's that they've become one additional, genuinely valuable layer in a much larger, more complex campaign, adding persistent low-cost pressure and coastal denial capability that complements the far more destructive weapons still doing most of the heavy lifting, rather than substituting for them entirely. That layered approach actually maps really well onto what's needed against Iran's specific naval threat, because Iran's fast attack boats operate primarily close to shore, hugging the coastline and hiding among the hundreds of small islands and inlets along the Persian Gulf and the approaches to the Strait of Hormuz. Cruise missiles and manned aircraft are extremely effective against larger, fixed, or slower-moving targets. But chasing down individual small, fast boats darting between coastal hideouts is a genuinely different problem, one that favors persistent, cheap, expendable platforms that can loiter, search, and strike, without risking a pilot or burning through an expensive missile on what might turn out to be a single small skiff. That's precisely the gap Ukrainian-style sea drones are built to fill. And it's precisely the gap that's opened up as this conflict has ground on, and Iran has leaned more heavily on dispersed, hidden coastal assets, specifically because they're harder to hit with conventional strike packages. Let's widen this out a bit and talk about how the Pentagon's own budget priorities have shifted to reflect all of this, because the numbers here are genuinely striking. Defense officials requested something in the neighborhood of $13 billion, specifically for drone development and defense capabilities in the most recent budget cycle, with the Navy alone looking to roughly double its own drone funding compared to the year before. That's not a marginal adjustment, that's a fundamental reallocation of resources toward exactly the category of warfare Ukraine spent the last several years proving out in real combat. And the Navy's stated ambition matches that funding shift, with officials publicly talking about fielding thousands of small, uncrewed surface vessels across the wider Indo-Pacific region by the end of the decade, a scale of deployment that would have sounded like science fiction only a few years ago, and now reads as a fairly conservative extrapolation of a trend that's already well underway. It's also worth noting that Ukraine isn't the only country whose battlefield lessons are shaping this shift, because Russia itself has spent the past couple of years scrambling to build its own version of these drone boats after watching its Black Sea fleet get humiliated by Ukraine's innovation, with several of Russia's newer unmanned surface vessel designs reportedly directly influenced by the very Ukrainian boats that were sinking Russian ships in the first place. That's a strange kind of validation, watching your adversary copy your own weapon because it worked too well to ignore. And beyond Russia, a growing list of navies around the world have started taking preliminary steps toward fielding their own sea drones after watching what unfolded in the Black Sea, including Israel, Poland, Lithuania, and the United Arab Emirates, with even non-state actors like the Houthi rebels in Yemen adopting similar sea drone tactics against shipping in the Red Sea. When a tactic gets copied this widely, this quickly, by allies, adversaries, and even loosely organized militant groups all at once, that's usually a pretty reliable sign the underlying innovation was genuinely significant rather than just a temporary battlefield curiosity. It's worth understanding in a bit more detail exactly how sophisticated Iran's coastal concealment tactics have actually become, because it explains why a slow, patient, persistent hunting tool like a sea drone matters so much here. Iranian forces have spent years building hidden launch positions along the coastline for their anti-ship cruise missiles, positions disguised well enough that from the air they can look like nothing more than an outcropping of rock, with the missile system itself popping up only at the moment of launch before disappearing back into concealment. That level of camouflage is specifically designed to defeat the kind of high-value, limited-quantity strikes that cruise missiles and manned aircraft represent, because you can't justify spending an expensive munition on a target you can't even confirm is there. But a persistent low-cost drone that can loiter for hours, quietly watching a stretch of coastline, waiting for exactly the moment a hidden system reveals itself, is a completely different kind of threat to that concealment strategy. One that doesn't rely on catching the target in the open through luck or perfect timing, but through sheer patience that a manned aircraft or limited missile inventory simply can't match. That's really the core value proposition Ukrainian doctrine brings to this fight. Not raw, destructive power, but the kind of relentless, expendable persistence that eventually defeats concealment through attrition rather than through one perfectly timed strike. Let's bring this back to the specific naval picture against Iran, because that's ultimately where all of this doctrine and technology transfer is being put to the test in real time. Iran's naval assets along its southern coastline have been a persistent target throughout this conflict. Missile-armed fast attack boats, coastal radar, and surveillance positions, and the network of hidden inlets and small ports that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy has relied on to disperse its fleet and avoid presenting easy targets for conventional strikes. The strike on that Iranian port using a one-way attack sea drone wasn't an isolated experiment. It was effectively a proof of concept for exactly the kind of persistent coastal pressure that Ukrainian doctrine was built around, closing off the gap between what cruise missiles and manned aircraft can efficiently hit and what actually requires patient, close-in, low-cost persistence to root out. And given how heavily the Pentagon has already invested in scaling up domestic production of these Ukrainian-designed platforms, it's reasonable to expect that First Strike represents the opening chapter of a much larger campaign rather than a one-off demonstration. There's a broader strategic point buried in all of this that's worth drawing out explicitly, because it says something important about how modern naval warfare is actually evolving in real time, not in some theoretical future scenario, but right now across two different active conflicts on opposite sides of the world. For most of the last century, naval power was measured in tonnage, in the size and number of a country's warships, aircraft carriers, destroyers, submarines. Ukraine essentially proved that equation is no longer the whole story, that a determined, innovative force with essentially no traditional navy at all can still impose real, sustained costs on one of the largest conventional fleets in the world through cheap, fast, expendable technology used cleverly and persistently. And now that same lesson is being actively applied by the country with the largest, most expensive navy on the planet against a regional power whose entire naval doctrine was built around exactly the kind of asymmetric swarm tactics this technology was specifically designed to counter. It's a genuinely rare thing to watch a piece of battlefield innovation travel this directly and this quickly from one conflict into an entirely different one, reshaping strategy in real time rather than getting absorbed slowly over years of academic study and procurement cycles. And there's a cost exchange dimension to all of this that deserves its own mention, because every time a cheap drone boat forces an adversary to expend an expensive interceptor missile or divert a costly patrol vessel just to deal with a threat that cost a few $100,000 to build, the economics of that exchange favor the side fielding the drones every single time. Sustained over months and years, that kind of lopsided cost exchange doesn't just win individual engagements. It can genuinely bankrupt an adversary's ability to keep defending against a threat that never runs out of cheap replacements. And that's precisely the dynamic Ukraine proved out against Russia, and that American planners are now counting on replicating against Iran. If you're finding this kind of cross-conflict analysis useful, now is a good time to hit subscribe, because this connection between Ukraine's naval innovation and the fight unfolding against Iran is exactly the kind of thread that's easy to miss if you're only following one theater of this broader global conflict at a time, and there's a lot more nuance here worth tracking as it continues to develop. Let's talk about what happens from here, because this technology transfer shows no signs of slowing down, and if anything, the pace appears to be accelerating. With a domestic manufacturing deal now in place to produce hundreds of these Ukrainian-designed sea drones on American soil, the bottleneck that's historically limited how quickly new naval technology gets fielded, the years-long process of designing, testing, and scaling up production domestically has effectively been skipped entirely. Instead of starting from scratch, American shipbuilders are taking a design that's already been battle-tested in one of the most demanding naval environments on the planet and simply scaling up production, which means the timeline from battlefield lesson to fielded capability against Iran has been compressed dramatically compared to how these things have traditionally worked. That compressed timeline matters enormously in a conflict that's still actively unfolding, because a naval capability that might have taken half a decade to develop from a blank sheet of paper can instead be fielded in a fraction of that time when the hardest engineering problems have already been solved by a country that had no choice but to solve them fast out of pure necessity. There's also a quieter, longer-term dimension to all of this worth considering, because the relationship being built here between American and Ukrainian defense industries goes well beyond a single naval drone contract. Ukraine has emerged from this war as one of the most battle-tested sources of real-world combat data on drone warfare anywhere on the planet. Air drones, sea drones, counter-drone systems, all refined under actual combat conditions, rather than in a controlled testing environment. That kind of real-world validation is extraordinarily difficult and expensive to replicate any other way. And it's part of why American defense officials have been increasingly willing to integrate Ukrainian technology directly into frontline operations, rather than treating it as a foreign curiosity to study from a distance. The counter-drone system deployed at that airbase in Saudi Arabia, the naval drones now heading toward domestic mass production, the direct training exercises between Ukrainian and NATO forces, all of it points toward a defense relationship that's becoming genuinely reciprocal rather than one-directional, with Ukraine's hard-won battlefield lessons increasingly shaping how the United States fights in theaters thousands of miles away from where those lessons were originally learned. And in return, Ukraine gains something it badly needs too: deeper defense industrial ties with the country still supplying the bulk of its heavier military hardware, along with tangible proof to skeptics back home and abroad that Ukraine's wartime innovation has real exportable value well beyond its own borders, value significant enough that the world's most powerful military is actively building it into frontline operations, rather than simply thanking Kiev for the lesson and moving on. So where does the naval fight against Iran actually go from here? Expect the pace of unmanned strike operations against Iran's coastal naval assets to increase as more of these domestically produced drone boats come online, adding persistent pressure against the small, fast attack craft and hidden coastal positions that have proven difficult to fully neutralize through cruise missile and airstrike campaigns alone. Expect the intelligence sharing relationship with Ukraine to keep deepening as well, particularly around tracking the broader web connecting Iranian drone technology, Russian production facilities, and the weapons still being used against both Ukrainian cities and American forces across the Middle East, since degrading that entire pipeline serves both countries' interests simultaneously, rather than being a one-sided favor in either direction. And expect other navies around the world to keep watching this specific application closely, because if Ukrainian-derived sea drone doctrine proves as effective against Iran's swarm-based naval tactics as it already has against Russia's larger, conventional fleet, that's a lesson every navy currently worried about facing a similarly asymmetric threat. from the Pacific to the Baltic to the Red Sea, is going to want to study and adapt for their own use. What makes this whole story worth paying attention to isn't just the tactical details of any single strike or any single drone platform, it's the broader pattern underneath it. A reminder that battlefield innovation doesn't respect geography anymore, that a lesson learned defending a port in Odessa can end up reshaping how a fast attack boat gets hunted down off the coast of Iran within the span of a couple of years rather than a couple of decades. That's a genuinely new dynamic in how modern wars influence each other. A level of speed and directness in technology transfer between conflicts that simply didn't exist a generation ago, when lessons from one war might take a full decade or more to filter through doctrine reviews, procurement committees, and testing cycles before ever reaching an actual battlefield. And it's one worth watching closely as it continues to play out across multiple theaters at once. Let us know what you think about all of this down in the comments, whether you think this kind of rapid battlefield-to-battlefield technology transfer becomes the new normal in how future conflicts unfold, or whether you think the unique circumstances of Ukraine's naval war, fought against a single dominant adversary in a relatively enclosed body of water, make this a harder pattern to repeat cleanly in a different theater like the Persian Gulf. And if you want to keep following how this connection between two very different conflicts continues to develop, go ahead and subscribe and share this with anyone who's been trying to piece together how these seemingly separate wars are actually influencing each other in real time, because this is exactly the kind of story that gets lost in the noise of daily headlines, but genuinely matters for understanding where naval warfare, and modern warfare more broadly, is actually heading over the next several years. Thanks for watching, and we'll keep tracking this one as it continues to unfold, especially as more of these Ukrainian-designed platforms move from limited proof-of-concept strikes into full production and get deployed at scale across the Gulf in the months ahead.